Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming back again. So this is on testing strategies for the upper rhetoric phase. And I should clarify, I do teach humanities, so this is not like calculus test ideas. And I do teach juniors and seniors primarily, and this is something I've been working, I don't know, it's a work in progress. I'm sure 2 years down the road I'll be doing it slightly differently. But for me, the testing in the classes I taught was this kind of constant burr under the saddle. I felt like it was just, you have to test the students. I mean, it's an important part of the class is testing. But I just never felt like I was quite getting it, you know, like you just, I don't know. It just felt like something I couldn't quite reach the way I was doing it. And, you know, you want to know if you've successfully taught the student anything. You have to check. And in many ways, I think the tests are a test of your own teaching abilities as well as a test of the students' abilities. And so you really need to have that. And you do have to have a measure of objectivity to it. You know, it can't just be, you know, completely unmeasurable or indefensible. So, and you know, you have to be able to defend your decision for what grade you put on the test. If you have a student or a parent or the administration that wants to know why you did what you did, you kind of have to have something to point to. So there's this kind of, you know, mathematical aspect that is sort of necessary, because that's what the whole, at some point it becomes mathematical. You know, it's getting transferred into a GPA at some point. It's going on the transcript. It is getting figured in. So you have to have something. You know, I'm sure we've all had parents who occasionally want to know, why did my child get that grade, you know? And I like to be able to point to something. You know, like, here's what the assignment was, here's how they didn't fulfill it, and then you feel like you have a slightly defensible position. And it's not just about that, because if a student wants to know, why did I get a B and he got an A, if you can't really quantify what the reason is, then they can't get better. You know, like they need to be able to see what exactly the issue is. But I do think that the math aspect throws things off, kind of, for me anyway, in humanities classes, because the math is inevitable at some point. Even if you are doing a system of, you know, gold stars or something, at some point that gets transferred into the grade book as a number, and then goes on to their transcript. And because the math is kind of inescapable in some way, I do think the math paradigm can take over too much in the humanities class. And the thing is, math tests are beautiful things. Like, they really are just beautiful. They're objective, it's right or it's wrong. And I love it. That was it was like getting an amen. Math tests are beautiful things. So it's a right or a wrong answer. The only ambiguity on a math test is if you cannot read the student's handwriting, you know. And and there's a, you know, you can do partial credit, of course, like wrong answer, but, you know, you did part of it right, and you can do partial credit, but it's still very quantifiable. And because you have to quantify in all the subjects, I think that math test paradigm is easy to slip into, where you want something to be right or wrong and no ambiguity to it. It's sort of like you can just put a nice little X next to it. That can show up in humanities classes. I think particularly history. I think in lit we kind of see that there's, you know, we should want more creative work or something. But in history, we kind of want, you know, like, in what year was the battle of, or who were the four generals who, or, you know, whatever. So in lit class, if I was to give a test that was name 2 metaphysical poets, it's very clear, you know, if they put whatever, Percy Shelley, I can put a nice little X there, and it's easy to quantify. You know, you can say on a history test, Napoleon was exiled to the island of fill in the blank. The Iliad is written in what poetic meter? You know, what is the definition of a protagonist? These are all important questions, but they're also right or they're wrong. And it's easy, it's quantifiable, it's defensible. If somebody objects, you can look it up and show them that they're wrong. And I do think that there's a place for that. Like, there's an important place for that, honestly. You do need to know that the student knows the basics of the subject. And so there's lots of times when I will ask questions like that. In fact, yesterday I left my classes with a sub, and the lit class was just finishing up Pride and Prejudice. And every day I just ask them, are you current on the reading? It's an honor system. They say yes or no. If they say no, I kick them out of the room till they're done, and then they come back. And that goes in as a grade, but I just take their word for it. But you know, Reagan's thing about trust but verify. So I just left them with an essay that they didn't know was coming, and I just said, walk me through how Lydia ended up married to Wickham, beginning to end. And it's just the thing I'm checking is, when you told me you read the book, did you? So, you know, like, there's a place for that. And I think that it's important to make sure that you are getting the, you know, the general gist. But the problem is that I think if we stop there, then we are forgetting what it is we're supposed to be doing, right? A test, a really good test, should be measuring at the skill that you're trying to impart to the students. And if you just leave it as those kinds of questions, then the skill you're measuring is the skill of memorization. And there's a place for that. You know, that's an important skill in learning, is memorization. So there is a place for checking. Have you memorized what you're supposed to have memorized? I give lots of memorization tests in Brit Lit. Well, junior and senior lit classes, I make them memorize just a heap of poetry. And so they have to recite it, you know, it's memorization. And so I check, and they have to get up and recite any number of the whole host of poems they've had to memorize over the course of years. And I make them start beginning of junior year, and they have to know it all the way through graduation, so it doesn't like delete at the end of the junior year. So there's a place for memorization. But when you test like that in lit, then you're testing memorization, and then you're testing memorization in history, and then you're testing memorization over here, and you're not ever getting at the real heart of the, like, what are the skills in lit that you want them to be learning, and how do you test those exactly? And I think the trick is with the math, I think the reason the math test kind of throws us is that is a brilliant way of testing the skill of math, because you're presented with a problem you've never seen before. It's actually not a memorization. You know, like, math tests are testing your ability to solve the problem, and there's this whole wealth of stuff that you have to have memorized previously, but it's not just checking that. It's like, okay, here's something you've never seen before, now solve that problem. It's not like, you know, you don't give your math students a study sheet that has all the problems that they're going to solve tomorrow. They have to do it, you know, sort of coming to it, you know, without having seen those. So the math test, although quantifiable, right or wrong, no ambiguity, it actually is perfect at testing the skill of math. But I think if we then try and plop that over into lit or into history, suddenly we aren't testing the skill that we wanted to be testing. So I think the trick is to think, what are the skills that I'm trying to test in literature or in history or in, I teach apologetics as well. How do you test those skills? And so I could give my apologetics students just like define epistemology and, you know, like those kinds of questions. But I actually want to see, do you have the skill that I'm trying to teach you in apologetics? So if you think back on those, like Napoleon was exiled to whatever, it's just, can you memorize a fact sheet? Which just as easily could be like memorize all the birthdays of everyone in the NFL. You know, like the material is kind of, you know, neither here nor there at that point. And to be honest, they're never going to remember the facts anyway, you know. So if you spend all of your time trying to make them memorize these facts, those are going to be gone by next summer. And, you know, and they'll still retain some of it, but it's not like they could ever just reproduce all the facts on the fact sheet from history class, you know, a few months down the line. But if you're getting the skills in there, those are things that they're going to remember. You know, that's the kind of muscle memory stuff where they're going to remember how to unpack a text or things like that. So basically, I think of it like a cooking class. Like if you had a culinary school and all of your tests were like, what is this? It's an egg. What is this? It's flour. What is this? You know, it's baking powder, whatever. what are the qualities of baking powder and when do you use it? You know, you could ask those kinds of questions and they're important to know. Or you could say, bake me a cake and I'll see if you understand the rising, you know, qualities of baking powder. So you have to know all those things. You do have to know what an egg is, but at the end of the day, you're going to prove it by making a cake rather than just answering the questions on the test. So it's not to say there shouldn't be objective, memorized, important facts, because they all need to be there. But can you do something with them? And then can we measure that? So again, I think especially when we get into these kinds of tests in upper rhetoric, it's easy to let the students kind of blather on and sound smart without actually knowing any of the facts that they should know. Because, I mean, I'm sure you've all been there on an essay test where you don't know, so you just kind of throw dust in the air and you hope the teacher doesn't notice, you know? And so that can happen. In that Hideous Strength by Lewis, there's the great line about Mark Studdick, and it's not complimentary, that he had always done well on essays that require no exact knowledge, you know? And so you want them to have exact knowledge. Like, it needs to be like, no, there's something there and you're actually doing good work here, and it's not just pontificating and then getting credit for it. But I think when I first started teaching, I mean, I knew that, honestly. It's sort of like, yeah, you can't give a 12th grader a lit test that's all fill in the blank. I mean, that would just be, you know, obviously that's sort of elementary school level stuff. Sometimes I do, but not, that's more like I'm checking, were you alive and did you have a pulse when you were reading this chapter? and so I do check those things, but those are like daily quizzes, keep them accountable. You know, do you know who's who and what's what, and you know, those kinds of things. But when it comes to like, okay, here's your final, or here's a big unit test or something, I want them to give me something more than that. So I was doing essay tests, you know, from when I first started teaching, and I would try to, this is why it was always this kind of like annoying thing. I was never happy with the essays I was getting back, because I would tell them like, here's your essay question. In 600 words, address the theme of revenge in Beowulf, making sure to discuss the Finnsburg fragment, or the Finnsburg episode, and compare it to the Finnsburg fragment, Grendel's mother, and Beowulf's own statement on the subject of vengeance. What do you think the poet thinks about vengeance? Go. And you've put everything in there, so if they write their 600-word essay and they forget to talk about the Finnsburg fragment, I can point back and say, see, I said to talk about that and you didn't, -10, or you know, whatever it is. And so I would give these questions, and then I would get back the same essay 26 times or whatever, and it was like, but see, the other students remembered that and you didn't talk about it, so I will dock you for that. But it didn't feel right, you know. It was like, I don't like the way this is going. And if I just said, discuss revenge in Beowulf, and then one kid managed to hit all the important things and then somebody else didn't, and I'd be like, well, I didn't tell them to. So do I mark them off or do I not? So then I would start saying, okay, but I'm telling you to. Make sure you talk about the Finnsburg fragment, you know. And then, you know, you can tell if they forgot what the Finnsburg fragment was, but it was just, honestly, it's a giant fill in the blank. Like, it's a, you know, 600-word blank, so it's longer than an elementary school blank, but it's still the same thing, where it's like, here's what I want you to say. We spent many class periods talking about it. Now you show me that you were awake during that time. But then again, it's just memorization again, or it's at least, were you listening in class and can you prove to me that you were listening in class, which is just not what I was trying to get at. So basically, I think, at least initially, I was giving very grammar level tests, even though it was in the sort of guise of an essay question. It was just, you know, and it never felt right. It was always kind of irritating to read, because you would have the kid who gives you exactly what you said in class, including your own examples. And you're like, okay, well, good job, you know, you were listening. And then you have another kid who just sort of wings off and says something that you didn't ever talk about in class. But those were always the ones I liked reading, because it was like, hang on, there was an original thought, you know, look at that. But then it was like, but I didn't tell them to have an original thought, so it's not like I can grade him higher than the other kid who just told me exactly what I had said. So anyway, that's why it always felt like I wasn't getting at what I wanted to get at. So I ended up, now I do, for my big test, it's all oral testing, and they do it in front of the class. But the way I sort of got there was I started asking questions because of that sort of frustration. I started asking questions that I had no idea what they were going to say. And it was something that we had not talked about, they'd not thought about, I've not thought about. So it's like, I don't know what you're going to do about that. So it was just kind of one experimental test where I said, compare Mark Studdock in That Hideous Strength, because they'd read that, to Vortigern in Geoffrey of Monmouth, History of the Kings of Britain. I'm like, I don't know what they're going to do, but try that. And so the thing is that they have to know who Mark Studdock is in order to answer the question. They have to know who Vortigern is. If they don't, then clearly the whole thing will be a disaster. But then I'm asking them to do something new with it that I hadn't told them. And then I got 26 different essays instead of reading the same one over and over and over and over, which is very tedious for everyone. So that was kind of interesting. And then I started thinking, okay, I'm going to just give everybody a different question and see what they do, rather than everybody has the same question and I'm going to compare yours to his. And, it's just like, I'm going to give everybody a different question. So I moved to the same kind of concept, but oral in front of the class, because then you can, that was my experience in college at New St. Andrews. It's all oral finals, and then your professor has the chance to follow up with questions, and then they can find out if you're bluffing. And so that's actually really good, because at least for me, like say it's spring break and you're grading a pile of essays, you can't find out, like, does this kid know what he's talking about, or is he just blowing smoke right here? And then I always tend to want to give him the benefit of the doubt. I know there's some teachers who go the other way, but I always feel like, well, he might have known. There might have been a smart thought buried in there. But at least with an oral test, you can just ask, like, what do you mean when you said that? And then you can easily find out if they know what they're talking about. I also really love moving them away from the more sort of artificial format of the 3-point paragraph, where they just have to get up and answer the question. I love the grading, because when the student's done, I'm done. So I grade it as they go, and it does take a lot longer in class to get through that many oral presentations. But then I don't go home with a huge stack of tests and essays and things that I have to grade over break. That's a purely selfish reason. I really like it, but I also like it that, like, in the moment, I'm just focused on that student, where if I've been grading the same essay over and over, you start to forget, was that this one that said that, or was that the previous one? It can all start to kind of blur together. So I really like the grading part of doing that kind of test, but I also think I'm giving a more accurate assessment of each student. And so the way that I have sort of ended up doing this is, for final exams, I will give the kids, I just have a whole bunch of topics or questions. It can just be a sonnet, or it might be a question about a work, or it might be compare those two characters from two different works. It might be, whatever. And I just come up with a big list of them. And then I literally print them on a sheet of paper and cut them into strips. And then I have that, and then I have another pile, which I'm not doing it this year because they've restructured how they do the class. But I was teaching British literature, and the students were also taking British history. So the history teacher did the same thing, would come up with, here's 26 questions, cut them into strips, and we have one pile of each, and the students literally pick one out of each cup, and then they have two totally unrelated topics, and we give this to them maybe a week before the final, and then we say, you have to get up and give us a speech that addresses both of these topics in one unified speech. You have one thesis, and it can be anything. So it's like, let's say, compare Jane Austen's humor to Jonathan Swift's humor. Like, that might be in one cup. So compare Austen and Swift. And then they might get, on the other side, Elizabeth II's family, how she came to the throne, upsides and downsides of her reign and her descendants. Go. And then you have to do one speech that integrates both of those. And it was such a success. Like the first time we did, I was like, well, this might be the biggest car crash that we've ever seen. And we started by the history teacher and I would pair, like we randomly paired them, but then we kind of made sure we would both look at it and we're like, oh yeah, you can do something with that. And then, but honestly, there's no, like we never hit one where it was like, that's impossible. You couldn't possibly say something interesting about that. So then we just started having it completely randomly assigned. And the students love it because they're kind of given something challenging and they don't know what's coming at them. It's different than everybody else's. And they actually got really sort of excited about it. I mean, it's kind of a love-hate thing, but at the same time, they are more excited about finals than I have ever seen a class be excited about finals. And the thing is like at that point you are giving them a rhetoric level assignment where you have to, I mean, like you can't answer the question if you don't understand Jane Austen and Jonathan Swift, right? You have to know who they are. There's all of that sort of base level stuff you have to understand. You have to know about Queen Elizabeth's reign and things, but the putting them together is the part that they really get excited about. So we've told them you can have a history thesis and you're using the lit as part of your argument. You can have a lit thesis and you're using history. You can have a political thesis and you tie in both. Does not matter. Like, but you can't give us two different presentations. And we've had that before where the kid just like can't integrate them. So it's like they answer this question and then they answer this question without making them, fit. And then you have something that's like, okay, you got something interesting here and you did fine there, but you didn't integrate them. So then, you have to work out how you're going to grade there. But there are clear parameters. It is objective enough that you can quantify it, but it gives the student something really interesting to work on. And the great thing is it's like you can't, I mean, that's not something where no, it's not true. You always have to worry a little bit about cheating, but like I suppose they could, cut and paste something about Queen Elizabeth's reign. But it's not like you can Google that question and have somebody has answered it for you. Like you really have to do the work yourself. And I don't care if they go talk to their friends about it and get ideas from their friends because that's perfect. I mean, it's like now they're all talking about that in the hall and giving each other ideas and how can you fit those two things together? And I'm like, well, that's just a win all around. And then the way we were doing it when it was two classes is the student would get up and so it was both their history final and their lit final was riding on this one presentation. And they can type it up, they can come up with the scrawled bit on a paper towel. Like that part is not what we're grading what they say in their presentation. I do ask for the copy. Whatever they bring up to the front of the room, I ask for it at the end because if it sounds like Wikipedia, I want to be able to check. But for the most part, like I don't have to even worry about that. We just grade them on what they say and follow up questions and we push back on it. And then I would grade the lit piece of the test and the history teacher would grade the history piece of the test. But then we also grade the integration. Like, did you turn it into one interesting topic? And then I actually, the way this worked out, there's lots of ways you could do it, but since I teach apologetics, that integration grade went into their apologetics grade book because that is an apologetics skill, is the ability to connect this topic to that topic without changing the subject, like how to get from here to there. So they would get different grades, but like you could ace your history final and bomb your lit final. Like it is possible to do it like that, and we've had that happen before, but for the most part the students really enjoy the challenge and they've gotten really excited about it. This year, since I don't have the history piece, what I've ended up doing is I will have one sort of question, in this cup, and in the other one I will have like just a list of sonnets or poems or whatever, and then they have to just talk about that and connect it to this, and the students have really enjoyed it. In apologetics, so that's how I do my lit one, just because I'm trying to get them to, have original thoughts, defend it from the text, that kind of thing. In apologetics, I have done different things, but one that I really enjoyed this Christmas, right before Christmas, we did an oral final for them where same thing, I gave them 2 topics about a week in advance, but the first one for everyone was the top song on your Spotify list. So it was right at the end of the year, so Spotify had just given everybody their, like, here's your listening, report from the last year. Here's your most listened to song. Here's your most listened to genre. And most of the kids are on Spotify, so they all had that data. And I was like, you cannot go clean up your Spotify list. Like, this has to be, like, honest. What's your top listened to song that you've been listening to? And that's one topic. And then here's your other one. And that was actually a really fascinating assignment for all of them. And they were all sort of like, oh no, at the very beginning. And it was actually a really valuable assignment in a lot of ways, because I'm not coming in and saying, what's that song on your Spotify list? But at the same time, having them have to get up and discuss this song, the worldview of this song, that was a complicated one for some of them. And some of them said, yeah, this is not on my list anymore. Like, that was actually kind of an interesting piece. And some of them did say, like, yeah, I think I'm going to go through and edit my list, my playlist now, which was just an interesting benefit. But like in apologetics, I'm trying to get them to analyze the worldview of things. And so that was a perfect example, but it was also not me trying to pick what's the most popular song right now and then here, analyze this song. It was like, you give me your favorite and then let's analyze that. And there were some kids who were like, I don't really listen to music. But that's rare. Like, most of the kids are spending a lot of time listening to music. So that was an interesting assignment. And then second semester, what I've really enjoyed is I give them a list, same thing, like, one for each student in the classroom, different quotes from atheists that we have looked at over the course of the year, or they should at least, it's the same argument as things we've looked at over the year. And I give them, I try and cover lots of different objections. So it might be the problem of evil, or it might be, whatever. So I have 26 or however many kids are in the class. It's only 22 or something this year. And I give them all the sheet, a week or two in advance, and they can think through how they would answer each one of those questions. But then in the final, they get up to the front, excuse me, they get up to the front and then they find out which one it is. I just read them there. It's like, here we go. So I have a copy here of this one. So philosopher Paul Kurtz agrees that the goal of humanistic morality is the enhancement of the good life, happiness, and well-being for the widest number of individuals. To continue with Kurtz, he mentioned that this goal is not limited to our humanist minority. This point of view came into prominence in Europe during the Renaissance. It is expressed in the Declaration of Independence, and indeed in virtually every modern democratic system of ethics. People may dispute about the meaning of happiness, but nonetheless, most humanists say that the good life involves satisfying and pleasurable experience, creative actualization, and human realization. Both religious and non-religious people can share this goal. To reject it would be to repeal the modern world. And so it's like, they're up front, I sit out in the desks, and then I'm an atheist, and they just have to, show me that they can interact with this argument like a Christian for 3 minutes or whatever it is. And it's short, but you can find out a lot. And if they kind of go, it's very obvious. And so if you gave them that in written form, they could sit there for 2 hours or whatever and stare at it, and they could muddle up something. And then when you're grading it a week later, you could think, does he know? But it's very obvious in the moment. If I just ask follow-up questions, I can easily see if they know what they're talking about. But I do try and give it to them in advance, because I want them to have to think through each argument and then show me on one that you know what you're talking about. Because the thing with the oral testing, because it's in front of everyone, you obviously can't give everybody the same question. So you have to work through a bunch. And I don't mind only asking them one when they've prepared for 22. I mean, that's great. But the other just sort of logistical thing that we've had to work through is, because this takes longer, especially the integrated one, each student is up front for 15, 20 minutes. And so that's a number of days. So it takes, like finals week, we just go from day to day, and we take, a lot of different blocks in the day. And if you have a kid who goes Monday morning, making them come to every other one seems kind of tedious, but we do want everybody in the room so that everybody has the same experience of having a full room. So what we do is some of the follow-up questions are asked by the other students in the room, and we grade those students on the quality of their questions. So to show that they were listening and engaged and so forth. And that's not a big part of their grade. It's just enough to try to make sure that everybody is listening and they're not all sort of asleep while the poor last one is up there at the front. So we do try to keep it like as close to, you know, the same experience for everybody throughout the week. But I have really loved that because it's more interesting for the students. It's more interesting for me. I feel like it's a far more accurate picture of how is this student doing. I feel like you can get at things in an oral context that you can't in an essay. I still give essays, you know, I still ask them to write stuff out for me, but I've switched more to this kind of thing. And then again with the poetry, I said I make them memorize a lot of poetry. So they start at the beginning of junior year, they memorize the opening of the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, Ovid, a quote from Aeschylus. And so that's a fairly easy chunk, you know, junior year. Senior year, they get a whole bunch. They just have loads of different poems and quotes and things that they need to be able to recite. But you can't get through that much stuff, obviously, in a class period orally. So same thing, they come to the front, they don't know what they're going to have to recite, and then we've done different things. One year I had a bingo wheel where, you know, they would, whatever popped out, they had to recite that poem. And I used to make them memorize the poetry, but they would write it out for me on a test, you know. And when I switched to doing it in front of the class, they memorized the poetry. And when you're just asking them to write it on a test, they'll be like, maybe she won't ask the Fairy Queen one. I won't bother, you know. Or if they didn't know it and they just leave it blank, it's not an embarrassing moment. But if you're up in front of the class and you just don't know, it's worse. So honestly, the students' performance has gone radically up since I've had them step to the front and now say the opening of Chaucer in Middle English. So I do make them do the opening of Beowulf in Old English, the opening of Chaucer in Middle English. And for those, because it's impossible to spell, you know, you can't really ask them to spell in Middle English, it's just rude. So I would make them step out in the hall while everybody else was taking the test. I'd call them one at a time, and they'd come out in the hall and recite it. And it was when I noticed, like, hang on, when they have to do this face to face, those are the ones they know. And the ones that they know are just going to be written, they don't know them nearly as well. So when I switched to, like, everybody does it up front, it's amazing. They know tons of poetry.
Are they still graded on it?
They are graded on it.
What do you grade them on? Do you grade them on the...
On that, it's just accuracy. Okay. Yeah. So it's not like a speech meet or something where they have to dramatically recite it. At that point, I don't care. It's just memorization. Mm-hmm. So there is a slew of quotes from Hamlet that they have to be able to quote. And those are harder because some of them are quite short. So that's funny. I will pull them to the front and I'll describe a situation in which you could quote Hamlet if you were thinking. And then they have to sit there and think, wow, what Hamlet quote would fit this situation? And so then they can do it. And that one is always very funny. So we have Hamlet and Much Ado About Nothing quotes that they have to sort of, like, you know, it's funny. They're very random hints that I give them in that one. It's like, your friend asks you to babysit his 2 hedgehogs while he's gone. You accidentally kill them. And then when he comes back, you have to say, they're like, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead. But that one is sort of like, in what context would you ever say Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead? But still, it's like, you know, some of the other ones are a little more life applicable than that. But anyway, so in those, it's just like, so there's a little bit more there.
Percentage of, like, do you just kind of, you know, eyeball it, like 30% of they kind of forsake it on?
Yeah, so that is tricky. So what I usually do is I have the whole mess printed out that I'm looking at, and then they either draw something out of a cup, or what I really want is a big roulette wheel on the wall, but they have to spin, or a dartboard or something that they have to see what they hit, and make the the hardest one is the wall. I don't know. But but they don't know what they're going to get. Usually the most recent one, so like the most recent one that they've done is Donne's sonnet, Batter My Heart. So everyone does the most recent one. So they come to the front, everyone has to do Donne, and then they roll the dice or something for the other one. And so I have everything printed out. I just kind of like highlight the number of the one they did. And then if they're doing 2, then each one is worth half. And so if they get Shakespeare quotes, then I usually ask them about 3 different quotes. So it does quantify. But if you get a short little thing, like if you just get Ovid and then you miss half of it, then it is worth 50% of the test. And so I do it usually if it's like a little ticky-tack sort of thing, like they singular plural or they didn't get them these or something, I take off 1 or 2 points. If it's a word, it's 2 points. But then when it gets to be like you forgot a whole line, I go to sort of proportion of the poem. So yeah, it's not perfectly objective, but that one is still slightly more quantifiable. So anyway, yeah. So any other questions on this? I've really enjoyed going to this format. So yeah.
How young do you think you would push this?
Yeah, so I think the integrated stuff, that to me is an upper high school kind of thing. I mean, I have a freshman and a sophomore children, and they both could do it, but it certainly wouldn't be the same quality, you know, as the upper grades. So I could see kind of like wading into it a little bit. I teach a sophomore rhetoric class, and I decided, why not make you memorize poetry in this class too? So I started doing that, and that's an obvious one. Just come to the front and recite your poem. That's obvious. But then again, that's just testing memorization. But yeah, I mean, I feel like it would be great to start integrating, but honestly, at least, I'm sure every mix of kids is totally different, but when I teach sophomore rhetoric, they are not yet in the rhetoric phase. I mean, they're still very kind of, you know, logic phase, and we're just working in rhetoric, we're just working on having an opinion. It's like, my approach to that class is, it's like how to have an opinion boot camp. And it's very hard for some kids to have an opinion in front of people about something. I mean, and that's what I like. If you assign them sides in a debate, they'll do great. But if you say, you know, bring up some ethical dilemma they've never thought about before, or what do you think of, I don't know, something in pop culture, and I ask for a, you know, like if I say, okay, who thinks this is a sin, you know, whatever, and I ask for a show of hands, some kids are like, fine, they're very opinionated, but there's a bunch of kids in the room who will look around real quick and then put their hand up. So we do blind votes, and it's very funny. And so I'm like, everybody heads on your desks, and then I will, it's actually really appalling, because it's like, you know, everybody's heads are on your desk, and then I'll describe some like super sad situation or someone, you know, they're gonna die and they're in a lot of pain, and it's just, you know, there's no chance that they're going to recover. Should we just end their life, you know, humanely? And the thing is, they all know what they think about abortion, but many of them they don't know the word euthanasia. They don't know, they haven't thought about it. And so you're like, how many of you should we just put them out of their misery? And, you know, you'll get a whole bunch of them. Yeah, you should do that. But when their eyes are shut, it's a very different take, because everyone will look to the one kid who knows, you know, and we're like, that's a sin, and they're like, yeah, that's a sin. And so it's like making them do it blind, where they have to commit themselves and then defend it. And I just think they're still kind of at that level, I feel like. Not all of them, but as a group they kind of are. So I think I'm still trying to get those kinds of issues, have an opinion, be able to defend your opinion, be able to do it coherently and logically and stuff. So I'm kind of still doing that sophomore year. So I don't know, that's my tendency, is to think like, let's just get that sort of thing sorted out. Yeah.
Kind of along with that question, do you think that there still might be advantage to doing more oral style exams rather than written exams, say for the 7th and 8th grade?
Yeah.
Questions that are at that level.
Yeah, I totally think so. And I feel like one of the things I've noticed is the students love to hear themselves talk, and so they feel like I feel like they're being respected a bit more. You know what I mean? Like they feel like, okay, you're giving me a chance to, say something here. And I think 7th and 8th graders could really thrive on that. Some of them, it will scare into a decline. But I think that that's a really good thing for them to get over, is just, that sort of pressure of stand up in front. I think it would be an excellent exercise if you're keeping the questions that...
More dialectic questions
Uh-huh.
than rhetoric.
Yeah, totally. I think it would be valuable. But I honestly, when I teach juniors, but it's classical lit and classical history, and it's that one, I haven't figured out a way to make the oral part work yet, because I think in classical lit, it's a bit more grammar level, honestly, because especially for some of the kids, like, it's their first real dive into ancient lit at that level. So I'm making them keep track of who's who and who's a Trojan and who's a Greek, which I don't do that in, senior year, because they're reading English material, and it's like there's this sort of foreign sounding names, and I just want to know that they're following the plot and they're getting what's happening. So it feels like that's a slightly different kind of class. So I haven't done this yet with them. I would like to figure out how, but I haven't solved that one yet. So anyway, yeah.
So on this integrated project that you do with history and literature, do you have a rubric?
I do, and I even printed it out, and I forgot to make copies. But so I have a rubric for my lit grading sheet, and then I have the other one that I fill out that goes in their apologetics grade. So I'm doing both for the same, speech. And so I have the first one for the final is I grade these on 1 to 5, and they do change, but this kind of just gives me the basics to go through. Showed a competent understanding of the significance of the specific topic. Demonstrated a clear understanding of the book, not simply the smaller question. Demonstrated an ability to competently interact with the literary work in question. Excuse me. Engaged with the actual topic that was assigned. That's a big one, because it's easy to give them a topic and they're like, and that reminded me of this other thing. Totally, which I always call that toodly boogles, because have you done toodly boogles? It's like that card game where one person says something like ocean, and the next person says blue, and then the next person says, something that, yeah, so it's like you cannot toodly boogle your way through your, if this is the question, you got to stick with it. Clear thesis statement and conclusion, which can be hard for some of them. They say start here and they end over there, and gave specific, clear, and relevant examples from the text to support the argument. And again, that one's big because I want them to be able to go to the text. You can have an opinion, but you got to prove it from the text itself. Supporting arguments were logically tied to the thesis, demonstrated original thought, not straight out of what we talked about in class. So, I try to make them say something different. Written in competent prose, creativity of synthesis, questions answered clearly, answers to questions demonstrate knowledge of the applicable material. Oh, and I do also just at the end in the Q&A section, we can throw them any question from anything in the whole. It doesn't have to be tied to their thing. So I will often read them the first line of a poem, and they have to tell me who is the poet and what's the school of poetry and stuff, just from the ones that we've really spent time on. So they do have to know more stuff. But then that's for how I grade what they're saying about lit. Then the apologetics side, the synthesis is clear. The synthesis is reasonable. It's not forced. Sometimes those can be, it can be hard for some of them to get something that's not just a really superficial connection. Synthesis demonstrates mastery of both subjects. Synthesis demonstrates creativity and original thought. Synthesis demonstrates the ability to focus on the most important part of the subject and not the trivialities. Supporting arguments clearly tied to the larger point and a clear balance of both subjects. So,
And would you feed them, if they didn't demonstrate it in the first part, would you feed them with your follow-up questions to try to get that?
I would, if it seemed like I wanted to know, did you know, like, was there a deeper connection there, or was it really that superficial? I would push there for sure and see if they can connect it. Because sometimes it's like, I might have missed it, you know, because you're just grading on what you hear, and it's like, did I not catch what you were doing there? You know, so yeah, I would definitely feed them on that. And most of the time, the synthesis is the thing they have to think the hardest about. So they're most prepared with the answer there, I think, because, you know, you can sort of research your history question and you can think about your lit question, but then that point of integration is the part that they really have to stretch their brains around. And I tell them, you know, I'm happy to help you come up with something, so they can come talk to me, they can ask other you know, like, that part is fine, but it's like somebody else can't write it for you. But if somebody gives them an idea, like, well, what if you tied those two things? And sometimes it feels like this was the biggest lob ever, because they're so obvious what the connection is. And weirdly, the students kind of get a little annoyed if they get an obvious one, which is kind of what tells me they really like the challenge of it. So my son, when he was a senior, he was like, really? Because I think he got like the theme of revenge in Beowulf, and then as one question, and he got Henry VIII in the other, and it was like, well, I mean, obviously you can say something there. Like, I think they really like it when it's something that they're like, oh no, I don't know what I'm going to do with that. And so that's when I started feeling like, okay, this is a rhetoric level test, because it's testing a skill beyond just, do you know what revenge is in Beowulf? So anyway, yeah.
About the grammar kind of part of the, you know, testing them, because they have to, obviously, I agree with you, and they have to, in order to be able to engage with the text, they actually need to know what they're looking at.
Yeah.
So what, you know, going back to math, what percentage do you think it is, you know, versus the final?
Okay, so I think that I don't have a specific place for that, because I feel like that's honestly, if they don't have that, the whole thing falls apart. And it's like they're not going to get any of the other things. You know, because if I say compare Mark Studek to Vortigern, and it's clear that they don't remember who Vortigern is, then they can't effectively compare the two. And so
what do you do with them?
Flunk them. Yeah, I mean, I try to give them, like, if they give me a valiant effort on Mark Studek, you know, I can give them some credit there, but it's sort of like you can't effectively compare them if you don't remember this one. So that's the thing that I like, is that it requires this sort of grammar level understanding of, you know, the basics. And without that, they can't successfully answer the question. So there's no one place where I ask for it, because I kind of feel like I'm asking for it everywhere.
But then do you give them those tests, you said, like on daily basis or regular basis, right? When you just kind of run through the facts.
I do
and
those.
They still get graded on that.
Yes, they get graded on those. And so I do them more junior year than senior, but especially when I start to get the vibe, well, you know, seniors in the spring, it's hard. And so especially you get the occasional one who's already been accepted to college, so they feel like nothing matters now. And it's very funny, because the way Brit Lit works, I mean, at least in my class, we go chronologically. So we start, it's much harder material at the beginning of the year. At the end, we finish with P.G. Wodehouse. And when you have seniors who are like, I don't know, it's hard to know what he's talking about. I'm like, now you got through Chaucer, so I know you can get through Wodehouse. But you know, the closer you get to graduation, the harder it is to concentrate. So I do start doing more checkups again, just to kind of keep everybody like, no, remember, you still have to pass. So I do more of those there, but junior year, they get them every single day for the Iliad, because I really want them to understand what's happening. Because if you get lost in like book 2 of the Iliad or something, then that's it. If you don't know who's who and so I kind of hold their hand a bit more in that class. And then Brit Lit, I just check in to make sure. My favorite answer that I ever got of all time was on a final, and I had this feeling, and so I threw in a few really easy little sort of almost true false level questions into the final, which I normally wouldn't do at all, but just checking. And I said, who wrote Tale of Two Cities? And this one poor little chummy, he said, Ernest Chesterton. It was like, right, you don't get to graduate. So it was good. That was my favorite. But I think he was sort of blobbing the importance of being earnest. It was all a blur for him. Yeah.
When they do their oral presentations,
Yeah.
Instead of the essay, do you allow them to have notes? They certainly
Yes.
can't read.
Yes. They can have notes, and the only thing I say is I want a copy of whatever you take up. I want a copy. I did have one girl one time suddenly it was very not her normal her normal voice in the middle when she was talking about a battle or something, and that was when I was like, hang on, I kind of want to see because she was reading her paper sort of, and then I googled it, and there was some plagiarism going on, so I just want to be able to check that, but I don't grade them on it. It's just merely for me to be able to double check if I'm worried about that. So they can have an outline, they can have a paper, they can have nothing.
They speak.
They speak. Yeah.
Do they have time to prep before, like few minutes before they go on?
So some of them they do. So like the integrated exam, they have a week, so they can write the thing, they can think about it.
To like gather their thoughts and kind of prepare.
Oh, they don't know who's going next.
All right.
So usually unless there's some complicated reason, where the basketball team has to leave, and so I'll say, okay, we'll make sure we get you guys in on Monday and Tuesday or something like that. But no, they don't know what day they're going to go, because I want everybody ready by the time the thing starts. And then in the apologetics one, they don't have any time to, they know the general questions that will be asked. They don't know which one they're going to get, and they don't have any time to prep.
It's on the spot.
It's on the spot. Well, on the apologetics, that one, I give them, here's all these atheist arguments, and if they want to just jot things down on it ahead of time, that's fine. If they want to take it up with them, that's fine. But I was like, if you're just reading off your little notes, you're going to get a bad grade. But if they just want to like highlight, this is the weak spot of the argument, make sure you hit that, that's fine. I don't mind if they take it up. But they don't know which one they're going to get until they're standing in the front. And then I hit them with something, and then I'm a rude little atheist at them. So, yeah. So, all right, looks like our time's up. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted you to kind of walk through at Lotus School, like from 6th grade through that, what prepares them to be ready for this, the key things that they want to be.
Okay, so from 6th grade, well, this will be very hazy because I don't teach in those grades. What I'm doing is in that sophomore year of trying to get them to just have an opinion, argue for your opinion, be able to engage with people, be able to defend your argument, be able to change your opinion based on what they said, that kind of thing. I'm trying to get them quick at that sophomore year.
You kind of say this, or how do you get them over that hump?
Yeah, in the rhetoric class.
Yeah, the sophomores that are reluctant to.
Yeah, the ones that are reluctant, it's always, that can be kind of sad, because if you have a shy little girl who really is, I try and be gentler with those ones than with the, cocky boy whom I'm always trying to smack down. So it kind of depends on the student, but I am devil's advocate all the time in that class. So I make them, even if they're right, I'm the devil's advocate and they have to argue. Or if nobody else is doing it well, then I'll take that position. And I just try and make them engage, defend a lot through that class. And then junior year, they're doing their junior thesis, and so they do a lot of little practice. I think they do it every term. They have a thesis and they're practicing. Maybe they don't do it till the spring. Anyway, they're getting that, and then senior year they do a thesis every term, building up to their big one, fourth quarter. So there's just a lot of, I think, practice for them. So, yeah.
Are they pretty mature by then that emotionally, they can handle it? Are they prepped?
I try to get them there.
The other teachers to get
Yeah.
to a place where they're okay.
Yeah.
Being,
Right.
Pushback and all that.
Having a lot of pushback. I think so. I mean, my son is a freshman. He's in freshman rhetoric right now, and that teacher is new, but she is fantastic at making him, on the spot, defend your opinion, defend it against all comers kind of a thing. So hopefully they're emotionally mature. We have had a few who aren't, and that's always traumatic, but